All right. So, George Schire, thanks for coming back to the show.
Hey,
Appreciate it.
I'm excited. It's always fun to talk. Old
I know
wrestling.
after our last conversation, I went out watched some more AWA matches that I could find on the WWE network.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask you a question. Do you think Vern Gagne was the reason that AWA didn't succeed because they had all of the talent? And the more that I looked at it, it seemed like he just kept giving himself the belt.
Well, okay. There's many facets to that, many answers to that question. Okay. First of all, let's touch on your last sentence you just said when you said Vern kept giving himself the belt. Um, I don't disagree with you on that. But there's always a but.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Vern's territory and you looked at any other territory around the country at the time, you would notice that the person in charge, the person that owned the company or whoever it was, usually was the person that ended up being champion more often than not. If you went to Detroit, where the Sheik had Farhat promoted, he owned the territory. I think if you go in and look at the title histories, the United States title that he recognized, I think he had it 1,000,001 times. Go down to Florida, you'd find the Booker usually being the guy that got the belt for a while or whatever it was. So to answer your question about Vern, Vern owned the territory. It was his territory from 1960 on. And you got to remember that Vern was a real wrestler. When I use the term real, I'm talking about he emphasized the amateur part and putting the actual athletics into it as well as the showmanship and the gimmickry. But Vern ran a company. And the way I've always explained it is if you own the company, probably naturally you're going to be on top. I'll give it to you as an example like this. For all my years of working, I worked in a bank. Well, the bank president also happened to be the owner of the bank. The CEO was the owner of the bank. It would be very unlikely that that CEO would turn over his reign or his power to some flunky employee who may or may not have the same uh, feeling for the bank or the same mission for the bank, what they were doing. So naturally, he's going to stay in charge. And I think if you just look at it in Vern's case, he knew he could always trust Vern Gagne. And when it comes to your title and how you want your territory to look and how you want your matches to look and your title situation to look, Vern always knew that he could trust himself. With exception of a guy like Nick Bockwinkel, who was totally loyal to Vern, and Nick had no personal agenda other than to be the best that he could be and make the territory as best that he could make it. And so he was the perfect match for Vern to pass that belt off for a while. But other than that, there were other wrestlers that came and went in and out of the territories for the whole 30 years that the AWA ran. And as a result, and there were so many wrestlers back in that era that can't throw their egos aside. And if they didn't like the way Vern ran the company, they might decide to test him a little bit. If Vern put the belt on him, they might decide they don't want to lose it. And so Vern was very careful as to who he put his belt on. He gave it to Mad Dog Vachon for 3 years in the mid 60s. And it's because, on camera and in the ring, Vern and the dog hated each other. But outside the ring, they had a respect for each other and a friendship that they weren't ever able to really share. They could actually at the end of the 80s when they buried the hatchet and became tag team. But Vern could trust the dog and he put the belt on him. People always ask, well, why didn't Billy Robinson get a chance at the title? If you wanted to look at a pure wrestler, probably a wrestler that was better than Vern, though Vern would have never admitted that. I saw many of their matches and they were, a lot of people don't like two baby faces, especially in a scientific hold for hold match, most fans would be sitting in their seats yelling, boring, boring. They want to see somebody hit with a chair and sliced open. I mean, it's just a difference. But Billy Robinson, if you wanted to talk about a wrestler that was really a pure wrestler and good at it, he should have been the champion. But he was one of those individuals that just a little bit, Vern couldn't trust him because Billy had an ego that when he didn't like an opponent or he didn't trust an opponent or he didn't feel you treated him with respect, he would make you look awful and he wouldn't put you over. And any great wrestler will tell you that you could be the best wrestler in the world. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term used about Harley Race. People have often said that Harley could wrestle a broomstick and the broomstick would look like he could beat Harley. And that there is what I'm getting at. Harley knew how to put guys over. And Harley was so good that he could make his opponent, and that was always the NWA champion formula. The NWA champion had to go into all the different cities and face a top challenger. It could be a baby, it could be a heel. And they had to, the champion had to go in and show the fans that he could be beat, that he should have been beat, that their challenger was better that night. That's the way the NWA was successful. And that's what Vern was able to do. Vern had many, many matches where fans walked away and said, oh, geez, he should have, he shouldn't have won. When Vern Gagne wrestled Cowboy Bill Watts back in the late 60s, 69, Watts was going to be leaving the territory. But they had the matches go around the horn in the AWA, and every AWA city, I think, had 4 matches. They did a little build-up for each match for each particular city. But if you watched those matches, Watts was not the greatest wrestler in the world. He was big, and he was I really hate to use the word clumsy because that's not fair, but he was big and he was believable. And anybody that watched those matches thought that Vern should have lost because Watts was the better of the two, the way Vern helped him work. And that's what makes a great champion. So Vern putting the title on himself, even now go forward when you're talking about could he have saved the AWA? Vern put the title on himself for the last time in 1980, and Vern was already well into his 50s. Probably over the hill at that point, and he was. He wasn't the same Vern Gagne I remembered from the 60s when he could fly around the ring. He had slowed down. But Vern Gagne, and this is what a lot of people, I always look at attendance. I look at how you draw. Vern Gagne, when he was on a card, up until his very last match, when he was on the card, attendance increased. His name was money. And he was living, by the time he was 55 years old and declaring himself champion, he was living on past glory, but he could still put the butts in the seat. It still meant something. And there was a story there with Vern in his Minnesota retirement where he was from Minnesota. He was an amateur. He represented the Olympics. He was a graduate here in the state. And all of that goes into it. And he could still put butts in the seat. Crusher and Bruiser, there's another example. That's off the title thing a little bit, but both of them were drawing money when they were well into their 50s, and they were far, far past the Crusher and the Bruiser that were so incredibly brutal in the 60s and even the late 50s. But they had that reputation. And the bottom line in pro wrestling is if a guy can draw money, it doesn't matter if he can wrestle or not. And the best example I'd give you of that, and I had a discussion with a guy on this just this morning, Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was not by any stretch a good wrestler, but Hulk Hogan had charisma and he had the ability to draw the fans in. And you give him a good opponent, and that opponent made him look good or better than he was. And a good example of that would be his matches with Nick Bockwinkel. Any fan that attended those matches, any average wrestling fan, believed that Hogan should have been the champion when he wrestled against Nick. But Nick made Hulk look good. And that was the role of Nick. And he was so good at doing that. Hogan, without a good opponent, the guy I was having a conversation with today was talking about, in fact, it might have been on one of your pages there, about the Dr. D book, Dr. David Schultz. David Schultz wasn't the greatest wrestler in the world, but he was one hell of a heel. And he could anger people, and he could put people in the seats. And you put him against the Hulk, and Schultz brought out a better Hogan. So the same as Nick. So that's where it comes into. Was Hogan a great wrestling world champion? No. But he drew people, and that's all that counts. And so any promoter that's in this business, they don't care if the guy is a broomstick. If he can draw the fans, okay, we'll put him over. Now, as far as Vern taking down the company with he had the talent, a lot of people don't know, Ed, or don't remember that when Vince McMahon took Hulk Hogan and then he took David Schultz, which was part of the deal. Hogan said, if I go, I want Schultz to come with me. What does that tell you? And they were enemies to the people, but they were friends. And then Vern took Gene Okerlund, and he took Jesse Ventura, and eventually Bobby Heenan and a few others left. But a lot of people don't remember that from 1984 to about the beginning of 1990 or 1987. So for about 2.5 to 3 years, any time that Vince McMahon brought his wrestlers into the, and I'll just use Minneapolis, St. Paul, anytime they came in here, Vern would run a card and Vern would outdraw WWF at the time. And Vince was coming in with Vern's wrestlers, the Hulk and Schultz and Don Morocco was there and Jimmy Snuka was. These are all former AWA guys. And Vern was still outdrawing him by bringing in his own talent like Jimmy Garvin and the Freebirds and the Road Warriors, and he had Mass Superstar, and he was still bringing in a lot of talent. He brought in Stan Hansen. He still had a little use of Brody in the beginning, and Vern was still doing good. The problem came in. What took Vern down is that eventually Vince McMahon was buying up in all the AWA cities, and he was doing this in other territories as well. He was buying up the TV times. He was paying TV stations. Seriously, he was paying TV stations to not run Vern's program and to run his. And he was also going into the arenas, to the auditoriums, and paying them to not run an AWA show, but run a WWF show. And Vince would pay them to do that. Those businesses, the TV stations, the auditoriums, they're running a business too. All they care about is making money and who's going to bring the money in for us. And so in the end, and then with by 87, 88, 89, the AWA, like a lot of territories, was becoming just a sad story to watch. It was like watching a person die that you loved because it was getting worse every day. And but Vern didn't take himself down. He tried, he fought. In hindsight, he probably could have done some things differently. In hindsight, he could have probably not tried to run cards in Vince's territory. And the other thing that took Vern down, along with a lot of the other territories, was when these old school promoters, Vern, Cherry Jarrett, Fritz von Erich, anybody else you want to throw in there, whenever they would try to work together, they fought amongst themselves because they wanted their own guys in their own territory to be the spotlight in the cards they were putting together, wherever they were promoting them, which made sense. But at the same time, they were all trying to be the chief. And you know that every company can't have more than one chief. Otherwise, you got chaos.
Do you think it was possible for AWA to be the number one to go national like Vince did, or do you think they needed the New York territory to be able to do that?
I think the primary ingredient was the East Coast had the biggest population, for starters. I think the key too was Vince McMahon Jr., who at the time when he started the invasion was only 33 years old. Vern Gagne was 55, going on for close to 60. Jim Crockett was old. Fritz von Erich was old. Eddie Graham was old. Don Owen was old. Sam Muchnick was old. Paul Bosch was old. Roy Schire was old. How many more you want me to name? You know, all these big old time promoters, and their vision was they probably thought about doing something like this, but they just didn't have the mindset to do it. It was a younger person. That was the key thing. And when Vince wanted to do it, you notice he targeted Hogan first. That was the one person that he felt he needed. And I think he was right. If I would have been him and I had opted to try to take on the world here, I probably would have went after Hulk Hogan too. There's been a lot of people that said, well, if he didn't have Hogan, he wouldn't have been able to do it. I don't agree with that entirely because Vince not only went in and took Hogan, you remember he went down south to Bill Watson, he took Junkyard Dog, and he eventually took the Freebirds. And he went into every other territory and took their stars. It would have taken him longer to go national, but I think eventually he was going to succeed. And the reason he was going to succeed was because he wasn't afraid to fail. And he had youth on his side. Plus, he started doing something that most everyone else didn't. He started offering real contracts. You know, back in my era, it was always talked about how wrestlers were under contract, but they weren't. They came into a territory, and I think you and I talked about this on our last visit. When a wrestler would come into a just use the AWA as an example, they would agree to come in for 6 months or a year, maybe 2 years. After that, they were going to move on. And it was always keeping the talent fresh, aside from your 3 or 4 or 5 guys that you had as your mainstay talent. So Vince saw it differently. He realized that if I go after one guy, and it was Vern that created Hogan. I mean, anybody that says differently is just living in a fantasy world. When Hogan came to the AWA, and I think I mentioned this to you last time, go on YouTube and look up Hulk Hogan. When he first came to the AWA, he had luscious Johnny Valiant as his manager mouthpiece. And Hogan, if you listen to him talk, he could barely put a sentence together. He didn't know how to talk on the mic at all, which was the reason they put Johnny Valiant with him, because Johnny was he had the gift of gab, and they tried to make Hogan a heel. The fans liked him because of his size, and you know it's hard to believe. I mean, it's hard for fans to root against somebody who's 6'6", all bronze, shiny, long blonde hair, and you know that sort of thing. But Hogan was created by Vern. The AWA wrestlers worked with him on his mic skills, and Hulkamania was created. The whole controversy too with Hogan was when he wanted to be going to Japan, and Vern and him had an issue over merchandise. Most wrestlers had those issues, though. You know, they didn't want the promoter taking a cut into their merchandise. And Hogan was one of the first that was really getting into the merchandise business with his bandanas and his shirts and, you know, all that stuff. So,
how much of a role did Rocky III play in the success of WWF at the time with Vince?
Well, I think it was a good sounding board from him. But when Hogan came back after the Rocky III tapings and the movie had been released, Hogan was with the AWA for quite a spell after that. What year did the Rocky movie come out? Wasn't it 82?
I think so. 82 or 83. Yeah.
It was either at the end of 82 or the very first part of 83. And Hogan was with Verne until the end of 80, the end of 83. December
Hmm.
of 83 was when he bolted. And again, in that situation, so how much Rocky played into it? Verne definitely capitalized from that, but he was Hulkamania before the Rocky movie. I mean,
Hmm.
he had been in the AWA since 1980.
Was he using the Eye of the Tiger song in
Yeah,
AWA? Oh, he
yeah,
was. Okay.
yep, yep, yep. And he'd use that. That was starting. That was almost in the beginning too of the entrance music for wrestlers, because in my era, wrestlers didn't have entrance music. I mean, with the exception of somebody like going way back, Gorgeous George. He used to play Pomp and Circumstance, the same song that Randy
Ah.
Savage eventually used. But that's what Gorgeous George did that. But that was back in the early 50s, even the late 40s. They would play it over the loudspeaker system, and Gorgeous George would come to the ring. But no other wrestler of that era had entrance music. And when Hogan came about with it, then it kind of got to the point where, everybody on the card, well, today, I mean, you got the low man on the totem pole's got to have this 5 minute entrance music before he can go in. But it's just a difference of how they train the fans. Because today, I mean, if you watch WWE, when the guy's coming out for his match, it takes him 5 minutes to get there, with the
Hmm.
fireworks going off and the loud music, whatever the song is, and the strutting and the dancing, and he's shaking hands or whatever he's doing. And by the time he gets into the ring, um, the match is shorter than the entrance. But again, it's what the fans pay for. The era today would not have survived in my era, and my era will not survive in today's world. That's just the way it is.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, why do you say that? Don't you think people like to see actual wrestling?
Back when I went to a wrestling card, if you had the first of all, you'd have an undercard, 2 or 3 matches, maybe sometimes 4 matches that were just the build up towards either the semifinal and then the main event. And those undercard matches were meant to just get the crowd into it, but not do anything that any of the guys on the top are going to do. So, and sometimes you'd have a 2 out of 3 fall match. Usually title matches were 2 out of 3 falls. Tag team matches. There's the greatest travesty is a tag team match. You used to
Hmm.
have 2 out of 3 fall matches. And the matches they put a 60-minute time limit on it. The match was never going to usually go 60 minutes, but it would go 30, 40 minutes. And you'd have the two teams switch falls, and then you'd have the blow off fall where somebody would get disqualified or somebody would win, or however it was going to go. But they could tell so many stories with it. The problem is that the mindset today of the average fan is they're sitting there, and they're not going to sit there for 45 minutes and watch my era of wrestling, where for 5 or 10 minutes, one of the wrestlers who was really good at it, putting a nerve hold on somebody and holding it and keeping it that way, and maybe choking the guy when the ref's not looking. They couldn't pull that off because the fans would be yelling boring. Today, you've got to have every wrestler coming off the top rope, bouncing off the rope, slamming out of the ring, flipping out of the ring, going through the ropes. You know, the fans want that, and it's got to be quick, 5-10 minutes at most. It's over. So
Mm.
I just think we live in a quicker world. I don't think people can sit through that. Just like
Yeah.
just like in the old days, you could go to a baseball game and you could actually sit there and enjoy the ball game. But now you got to, they want to rush everything along, get the game over with. 9 innings for some people, 3-hour game for baseball. a 3-hour game for some of these younger folks, that's half their life. Let me get out of here, man. I want to go drinking. I want to get out.
Mm.
Seriously.
I root for extra innings when I go. I want to see as much baseball as I can for
Well,
my
but
money.
but you see, you're an exception to the rule of your age group. How old are you again?
Oh, I'm 43.
Well, see, compared to me, you're a babe in arms. You
Right.
know. Um, but no, I remember 2 out of 3 fall matches, and in a tag team. Oh man, you could tell so many stories within that tag team match, and we don't have that anymore.
Who were
And
some of the great tag teams in the AWA? Obviously, the Road Warriors.
well, now see, you just committed the perfect sin, because a person your age, and this isn't your fault.
Yep.
And again, if I was typing this right now, you'd get on me because I'm attacking you. And I'm just joshing with you. But the Road Warriors, everybody your age group will say they were this fantastic team, and they they were good at what they did and how they did it,
Right.
but they weren't good, because in my era, the Road Warriors would have, and I know people hate it when I say this, but the Road Warriors would have been a preliminary match, a preliminary card team at best. They changed the tag team scene, because when they came on board, they did something that no other, and this is why they were good. They came on the scene and did something that no other tag team had ever done. They came in and they never waited for the bell to ring. They never waited to be introduced. They just came in and started kicking ass, beating the hell out of their opponents, pounding them. They didn't sell when they were attacked by retaliated by the opponents. They built themselves up to be Superman. The promoters allowed them to be Superman. And so then I ask this question: when they've proven this, and this to me was one of Vern Gagne's most fatal mistakes, you give them the tag team title. Now, if you're a wrestling fan, oh, that's great, they're the champs. But with the way they worked, who is ever going to be believable beating them?
Right.
No one. So they can't lose. And you can't have a champion that doesn't have the perception that they can lose.
Right.
So with the Road Warriors, they would have been better off being consistent challengers and having the fans know that they were better guys, because they got disqualified, or their opponent, the champions, got disqualified against them and kept the title. And as long as the fans could go home believing that they won, they were winners. But Vern made the mistake, which a lot of promoters wouldn't have done. He put the title on them. And then you've got the problem about who is going to beat them and make it believable. Vern he turned that mistake into what I've always called one of the most genius promoting moves he could have done. He had them lose the title to a team that nobody in their right mind would have believed could have beat them, and that was Jimmy Garvin and Steve Regal. What made it possible to believe it was on the night they lost the title, Garvin and Regal won because of all 3 Freebirds interfering in the match. And it basically ended up being 5 guys that beat 2. And the Road Warriors lost, and Garvin and Regal were the champs. But that was the only way that made sense, because there was no way that anybody could beat the Road Warriors in a believability fashion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Who did I like? I liked the Midnight Express was one team that I liked when I was a kid.
The version that was in the AWA?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, because we had the original version here. We had the Midnight Express. We had Pat Rose, Randy Rose.
Okay.
Randy Rose and Dennis Condrey. Excuse me. They were the original
Mm-hmm.
with Jimmy Cornette.
Right. And who were some of the other tag teams that were entertaining?
Well, definitely, if you want to go through a lot of the years when Vern Gagne was champion, and especially from about 1968 and then through the 70s, the AWA was more of a tag team territory. So we always had 2 or 3 or 4 teams that were in the territory at all times. But some of the really great ones, we mentioned Crusher and Bruiser.
Mm-hmm.
If you would have saw the Crusher and the Bruiser in the 60s as a team, in many ways, they really were the Road Warriors of the 80s because they were more of a just going to get in your face, kick your butt type guys. But Crusher and Bruiser were great. I mentioned Larry Hennig and Harley Race as a tag team. If you go to the 60s, I think if you went around the country and you wanted to pick out the 3 or 4 top tag teams in the nation, Hennig and Race in the mid 60s, Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson in the mid 60s, the Assassins down south, which was at the time Joe Hamilton and Tom Renesto under the masks, and any version of the Von Brauners, Kurt and Carl Von Brauner, they were really over. They were just good teams. The AWA had Hennig and Race, Crusher, great Mills and Kowalski, Tiny Mills and Stan Kowalski back in the early 60s. One of the greatest teams that never held the tag team title, and one of the greatest teams that, by all accounts, was just in the AWA as a team at the wrong time, was Larry Hyniemi and Buddy Wolf. They looked a lot alike. Their styles were a lot alike. They were excellent heels. They were excellent on the microphone, and they could get heat. But the problem when they were a team was that the AWA had Lanza and Duncombe. They had Vachon and Von Raschke. They had Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell. And Hyniemi and Wolf are just sort of lost in the shuffle. But they were honestly, and they're 2 of my favorite wrestlers individually, but as a team, I thought they were one of the greatest teams ever. That's just my opinion now when I say I think, okay? But they were really. I'll tell you a team that was really good in the AWA, and most of the wrestlers would tell you this too, the wrestlers that were of that era. Billy Red Lyons and Red Bastien, 2 great baby faces, complemented each other in their styles, both, of course, being redheads, but their styles were similar in the ring, and they were extremely over with the fans as a babyface team. And most of the wrestlers that were around them at the time, they would tell you they were an awesome team, but they never got to be champions, even though they had fans believing they could beat the champions, and they did beat the champions several times. The champs at the time were Mad Dog and Butcher Vachon. And Mad Dog and Butcher, Vern was doing dynamite box office with those 2 as his heel champions. So for 3 years, there was no reason to take the title off of them. And Bastien and Lyons would have been the logical choice as a babyface team, but the Dog and the Butcher were drawing money. And they were a good team. They were. I didn't care for the Vachons together as much as I did Mad Dog with Baron Von Raschke. I thought they were a better team. But during that 3 years with Butcher, they were drawing money. So those are some of the teams.
Well, what I think is really interesting, like I mentioned about the talent that they had, is when I was looking through some of the names that were in AWA at the time. I mean, it really is incredible. They were essentially a feeder system for what would become the WWF.
Yeah.
Right? Adrian Adonis, Bob Backlund, Jim Brunzell, Ric Flair obviously was a superstar. Scott Hall was there. I mean, the names are incredible, and I was looking at the champions from 1967 to 1984. The title changed times 9 times, but
Which the
there were only 4 champions.
the singles title you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah. Um,
I mean, how was Rick Martel as a champion?
I thought he was. I thought he was okay. Martel was a good wrestler. He was the epitome of the clean cut mom's apple pie good guy. Um, he Some of this can come off as my opinion, but I think that Martel is one of those guys that he ended up being AWA champion because he was in the right place at the right time. But had he been in the AWA 4 years, 5 years, 10 years earlier and been the same Rick Martel, he would have been, not saying he wouldn't have main evented, but he would have been more of a undercard guy. That's what his talent level was.
Mm-hmm.
But when you got to the time when he became champion, you had Nick lose the title to Tommy Saruta, Jumbo Saruta in Japan. And that was going to be a short-term thing. That was a deal that Vern worked out with Giant Baba to put the title on Saruta for a little bit. They had their own deal they worked out. But Vern came back and he put it on to get it off of Saruta. He gave it to Rick Martel. Now, Ricky had it for what, about a year? I think it was almost a year and a half. I don't have the dates in front of me. Vern's deal was with babyface champions. He didn't like having a babyface champion because and if Vern were alive, he could argue this with me, but I believe this. He didn't ever want a babyface to be more popular than he was as AWA champion. So again, his ego was playing in it. And he put the title on Ricky because Ricky was never going to be as popular as Vern Gagne. And Ricky didn't draw as well. So then you got a guy, Vern is still fighting this war with the East Coast Circus. And he goes out and he gets Stan Hansen to come in. Now, Stan Hansen, he was, like Bruiser Brody, King Kong Brody, he was the true example of an independent contractor. He wasn't going to let anybody boss him around, tell him what he had to do, could do, or would do. And when Vern brought in Hansen and was thinking about putting the title on him, which made sense because it was a huge name. And this is what Vern needed. That's why there's where the desperation was starting to set in, because Vern was fighting against WWF. And I say F because it was still F back then. So Hansen made sense in the fact that he was an international name. And plus, he was a name that was huge in the WWF. He had, been known to be the guy that broke Bruno Sammartino's neck. So Vern puts the title on him. Jack Lanza and Nick Bockwinkel, behind the scenes, told Vern, don't do it. Don't put the title on Hansen. You're going to have problems. Well, we all know what happened. Hansen was working Japan a lot, which was big money for him. That's where he made most of his income. He was huge over there. He had a deal with Baba, and Vern put the title on him. Vern worked it out with Baba originally that he would be able to use Hansen, but he was still going to be AWA champ. When Vern told, when Hansen was going to be going to Japan for a little bit longer time, Vern told him, we're going to take the belt off of you. And he was going to put it back on Nick. This is a true story. It happened in Denver the night of the match. Hansen was there. Nick knew about it in advance. Vern and Nick went into the locker room and they pulled Hansen aside and they basically told him that Hansen was going to drop the title. And Stan said, no way. I'm going over to Japan and I'm billed over there as the champion, and I'm not losing the belt. And Vern says, well, you're not going to keep the title. And true story, Hansen took the belt, left the building. There's no match. Now, this was a situation where a promoter had to, then people said, well, then there should have been a tournament and there should have been this and there should have been that. Well, Vern had to make a decision on the spot because he had 8,000 fans sitting in the Denver auditorium waiting for a title match. There's no opponent. The champion left. So Vern announced that by default, Nick Bockwinkel was the champion. Right decision, wrong decision, I don't know. Then there are fans that say about Stan Hansen, well, he was in his right to leave and take the belt because Vern was trying to take away, his title before he went to Japan. Well, here's a true story. You can look up the Japanese results when Stan was over there. He went over there and wrestled as the AWA champion with the belt. And he wasn't the champion at that point. But he did wrestle over there, and he got introduced as the champion. The fans over there, we were still in kayfabe in that era, 86. I mean, kayfabe was still alive. So the majority of the fans never knew it. But, and then Hansen sent the belt back to him after he ran over it with his pickup truck. So, sent it to him in a package and said, here's your effing belt. And
well, you mentioned that Vern tried getting into Vince's territory, and I know that Stan Hansen won the belt in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Against Rick Martel. So now do you think that was a flawed strategy trying to go to the East Coast for AWA?
I don't know that it was a flawed concept, but Vince McMahon had more practice at going into other territories. Vern was trying to do it. And you got to remember that during that time period, we had that pro wrestling, Pro Wrestling America?
Okay.
Some goofy promotional thing that he was doing. That's not right. I'll think of it. See, I don't have everything on the top of my head here. Vern was working with Jarrett and Fritz and Crockett, and they had kind of formed this alliance where they were using each other's guys, and they were going into some of the territory, some of the Vince towns and stuff. But that was part of that, what I mentioned earlier, where they were basically fighting amongst themselves because they all wanted their guys. And when you got that much talent, and the problem is again, it was the age and the mindset of these promoters. What I said to you earlier, they were all 50, 60 something years old, and they just didn't see the train coming down the track. And Vince, again, I think his youth, that was the key. So was it a mistake for Vern to go in? He did it with the right guy. He had Hansen win in Vince's territory. I don't have my stuff in front of me, but I think I have the attendance figures for that title card. But no, I don't think it was a mistake. It was the last desperate approach. And Hansen was, other than if you want to count, well, some people would argue with me and say Jerry Lawler was the last great AWA champion. But there were promotional problems with that too.
Yeah, I just wonder if it was simply a lack of execution, as opposed, that may have led to it. Because, like I said, I mean, they had the talent. I mean, they had the greatest talent in the world probably at that time.
Yeah, and that's very true. And it was a short-lived thing, though, if you recall. Vern wasn't into the East Coast too long, too many times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was Vince just had the ability to do it. In the end, and my wife would tell you that in 1985, when Vince put on his first WrestleMania, I remember I had the pay-per-view, I watched it, and the expansion war had been on about a year and a half at that point taken place. And I made the comment, I said, there is no way that Vince McMahon is going to eventually be the promoter of the country. I didn't believe it. I did not believe it. I thought WrestleMania 1, if you go back to it and you think about all of the junk that they did on there that had nothing to do with wrestling.
Right.
I mean, from Cyndi Lauper to Liberace, or was Liberace on the first one, or was that Muhammad Ali?
That was Liberace.
Liberace was. Yep. Liberace. You had Cyndi Lauper, and you had all kinds of goofy crap going on. I didn't believe that the fans that I grew up and knew around the country, I didn't believe they were going to buy that type of what I referred to then, and I still do today, circus wrestling. They were giving the fans everything but wrestling, but it worked. And that alone, it all comes down to the rock and wrestling connection. Remember they called it that?
Yep.
It worked. It brought two different venues together, music and wrestling. And wrestling became mainstream. Vince knew how to get to the networks. I mean, when he had his Saturday Night Live wrestling cards on NBC, that was the first time in 40 years that pro wrestling had been on network television. Any town it was in, it was on the local independent, usually showing late at night or some obscure part of the day. And it was, programming that nobody cared about.
Yeah, well, what is fascinating about it is, as much as people, want to hate on women's wrestling, is that the popularity of WWF was really based around a women's wrestling match, right? Wasn't it the Wendy Richter versus Fabulous Moolah on MTV?
Yeah. I mean, Vince, he's changed women's wrestling to what it has become today. In my era, women's wrestling was considered. I had nothing but admiration for the lady wrestlers. They worked hard and they were good at what they did. But most of the male, we had a lot of this male chauvinism and we had bias. Most of the men wrestlers didn't want to be on cards with the lady wrestlers. And the lady wrestlers, there were far and few between. Most of them, they traveled around to a territory and they'd be in a territory for a month and then move on, hit all the towns a month or 5-6 weeks, and they'd hit all the towns and then be moved on. And they were a lot like, to me, the most disgraceful thing that we had in the kayfabe era is the midgets.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. I've had people take me to task on this, but promoters in my era, they would go to their graves, and the wrestlers would go to their graves trying to convince fans that what they did in the ring was real. We weren't fake. We really hate each other. We really want to hurt each other. We really want to win the title. And then they would shoot themselves in the foot and put a midget match on a card where it was a 20-minute clown show, totally choreographed. A 5-year-old could figure it out. And I never understood why promoters did that. Now, when I say this, I also want to add that I think the midgets were talented. They were called midgets. I think what are they, little people today, if we want to be politically correct or whatever. They're not midgets anymore, but they were in that era. I have never been able to prove by attendance figures that the midgets on a card drew more people. And our AWA, every Thanksgiving night, we'd have a card in the Twin Cities. So the idea is you get together with your family, you have your turkey dinner, you watch football, and when you're tired of the family, you come to the wrestling matches. And we'd always have a good card.
Mm-hmm.
They'd always bring in the midgets for the card. And they'd say, and for you kids, we're bringing in the midgets. Well, I'd look around the auditorium and I'd say, well, there's no more people here now than there was last week without the midgets.
Mm-hmm.
I just was not a midget. And as much of an historian as I am, and I believe in results and I believe in getting it accurately, I personally do not and will not keep track of midget match results. I just won't. I'm sorry. I think they were an embarrassment to the sport when they called it a sport. When
Mm-hmm.
they wanted it to be real, then they put the midgets in there. And if you saw one midget match, I guarantee you, if you saw one, only one in your whole life, you saw them all because they were all the same. It was almost like watching a Ric Flair match. Oh, God, am I going to take it on that one?
I personally liked watching the midgets wrestle. I liked
I gotta go.
Little Beaver. I liked Little Beaver. I liked the gimmick match at WrestleMania 3. I thought it was all right. You know,
We had. I'll tell you, the gimmick match was probably okay. We had a deal in the '60s. Lord Littlebrook. You ever hear a midget wrestler, Lord
oh yeah,
Littlebrook? Okay.
of course. Yep.
He was like the king of the midgets. In fact, he was the one that basically most of the midget wrestlers, he was in charge of sending them out to the territories.
Mm-hmm.
Lord Littlebrook. In the 60s, Larry Hennig and Harley Race, they're feuding with the Crusher. And the Crusher, the Bruiser. The Bruiser's not always here because he had his own territory, but the Crusher would have other partners. And sometimes I don't need a partner to battle those two bums. And you got to have a partner. So the one time he goes out and he says, all right, I got me a partner. And he brings out Lord Littlebrook. Okay. I don't need a partner. I just need, well, the gimmick worked good because you knew what was going to happen in the match. Hennig and Race were going to beat the crap out of the poor little midget. And the Crusher was going to have to save the day, and he's going to have to get revenge at another match down the road. And there's poor little Lord Littlebrook. Crusher's carrying him out of the ring, and Littlebrook is bloody. And, the fans are, how can you do this? Hennig and Race. It was great for building heat. In that instance, I think they were okay. But just usually we had midget tag team matches. And putting
Right.
two teams together, I guarantee you, I saw one, I saw them all. I saw the same thing in every single match. The referee would get down on the mat, and all four midgets would be on top of the referee. And
That's funny. Yeah, that's
I mean,
interesting. Now
it's
that you
funny.
say, yeah.
It's funny, but if you see it more than one, I mean, how many times have you ever watched Blazing Saddles?
Oh yeah.
Can you laugh exactly the same way every time you watch it?
Right.
Okay, so if you saw him once, okay, that was great. I'm glad I saw him, but I'm not going to pay money to go see him again.
No, that makes sense.
And the lady wrestlers, as we started the topic on, a lot of the wrestlers back in that era didn't like being on a card with the ladies or the midgets. Part of it was it was wrong. I mean, the ladies were good; they were talented. We had so many great lady wrestlers in the '60s
Mm-hmm.
that deserve all the credit that they can get. But there were some guys that wouldn't want to be on a card with them. One of them, one of the most respected wrestlers in the game, and most often considered the best wrestler of all time, Lou Thesz. Lou emphatically said, I will not wrestle on a card with the women, and I will not wrestle on a card with the midgets.
Wow.
And he didn't. He was so good and he drew money, he could get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, he had his principle. His idea is that I am representing what I'm putting across as a sport. I do it to present it as real. I do it to present it as something that isn't fake. And he's not going to have the midgets underscore that, or the ladies. And the ladies matches, I mean, in all fairness, the 60s ladies tag team matches, the 50s too, you get a little hair pulling. The fans sitting at ringside, they think they might, see a boob or something. I mean, that's all it really was. It was more of a. It just was not part of the show, and for me, they did nothing. And I have nothing against women. Trust me.
Okay. Did Moolah or Wendy Richter ever make an appearance in the AWA at all?
Wendy Richter did near the end of Vern's AWA run, she had come through. She had already finished up with Vince or whatever
Oh, okay.
happened between them.
Yep.
Moolah never was never in the AWA. Boy, and I don't think she was in the old Minneapolis NWA territory either. But we used to have we had great lady wrestlers. Lorraine Johnson, Penny Banner, Jean Antone, Dawn Lemke, Kay Noble, Princess Little Cloud, June Byers. They were all excellent workers. Vivian Vachon, I mean, she kind of exploded lady wrestling a little bit in the early 70s when she came on.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the lady wrestlers were something that I never had a problem with because it was really only every couple of years, maybe once a year they might come through, but usually every couple of years you'd have a ladies match or a couple ladies matches on a card. And then they also did things in other territories where they'd have the mixed tag teams, where you'd have a
Mm-hmm.
lady guy on each team.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, they had
Oh,
mixed tag team matches. And they would work a deal there where if the lady tagged off, then the other lady had to come in. They didn't actually wrestle man
right.
versus lady. That they never pulled any of that stuff. Today in Vince's world, yeah, he's done it a few times. He's got the women knocking the guys around and vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. And I don't agree with that either. I don't think I don't think I don't think I've seen WWE matches where the men have been slapping the lady around a little bit, whether it be the manager or whatever she is. I don't agree with that. I don't think it puts across a good message, whether it's a show or not.
Right.
That's just me.
Let's get to a question here. Somebody wants to know thoughts on Larry Zbyszko in the last years of the AWA.
Well, Larry Zbyszko, as everybody knows, was the last AWA champion. Here's the problem I had with Larry. When he came to the AWA, and fans can go back and check this out. He came from the WWF with the history that he'd had there, that he had been Bruno's opponent and he'd been Bruno's protege. Excuse me. And when he came to the AWA, though, if you look at the results around the horn, literally everybody in the AWA beat Larry Zbyszko. Vern didn't use him for anything more than a mid-card guy. I mean, Larry did win some matches, but basically everybody beat him of the other main talent in the territory. And so they pretty much buried him for 2 years. Well, then all of a sudden, on the ending of the AWA, now behind the scenes, we know that Larry got married to one of Vern's daughters.
Mm-hmm.
So he became family. And towards the end of the line, it goes back to that old, well, Larry's not going to leave the territory now and go to Vince or go, he's going to stay because he's family. So they put the title on him. They worked out the good angle with him where he turned on his partner, Nick Bockwinkel. That was one of the angles. They had a couple different scenarios in other towns. But yeah, he was a good heel. I liked him. I thought he was good on the interviews. But I think at a different time, I would not have seen Larry Zbyszko as AWA champion. He would have been a great challenger. I don't know if that answers your person's question or not, but Larry was good. He just wasn't he wasn't a world champion candidate as far as I'm concerned.
All right. Well, before I let you get out of here, let me ask you one more question here. Do you think there's anything?
We've got to end for the night.
I know we do.
Come on, man.
Don't tell me
you have a life. Don't tell me you have a life, because there's only one thing that's more fun, and that's sex.
If there was one thing that Vern could have done differently, that would have saved the AWA in the mid '80s, what could that have been?
I don't think there's anything that he could have done. Because Vince originally targeted the AWA the heaviest from the onslaught of his invasion.
Well, that wasn't by accident. I mean, they had the best talent, right?
No, exactly. But
Yep.
he invaded the top territory on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But he also, and I always remind folks of this, Vern went down, but so did 20 other territories. Nobody survived when it was all said and done. And so to say that could Vern have survived all by himself, I don't think so. It just the business had just changed, and Vince had the right tools to do it. If Vern was the only territory that Vince had targeted and Vince had destroyed, and the others were able to thrive well into the late or mid 90s or even the 2000s, if all of that could have been possible and Vern was the only one to go down, then I'd say, yeah, Vern failed, and whatever he didn't do it well. But everybody failed.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all, and again, I go back to that old school mindset. Every one of those guys, first of all, none of them, the wrestlers and the promoters, they didn't believe that Vince was going to be able to eventually own the world. He was going to give it a good shot, but nobody believed he could do it. I remember Nick Bockwinkel telling me when Vince McMahon came out in 1989 and announced that wrestling was not a sport, it was entertainment. And he did that because he was tired of the athletic commissions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he came out and he admitted that wrestling was entertainment, that our matches are predetermined. Nick Bockwinkel told me, he said, and Nick's long gone, but I'll quote him when he said this. He said, there are a lot of guys that would like to see Vince McMahon right now at the bottom of the river with cement shoes.
Wow.
Because he broke that literally decades upon decades code of kayfabe. And there were guys that just couldn't deal with that. I think I mentioned to you one time before, and this will be, and I only bring this up because I'm thinking of it, but this will be my cheap plug for that book called Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. I've heard it's fairly decent. Eddie Sharkey quoted in my book, he said that he was so programmed to the kayfabe in his era that his very own parents did not know that what he did wasn't real. And he said they went to his grave believing that he was in this tough sport. That says a lot, because a lot of the guys, and in that era too, Ed, if a guy did blow the whistle, there were guys that did. They were blackballed. They were no longer used in the business. They were out. It'd be the same with any company you're in. If you give away the secrets, you're not there anymore. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, George, thanks so much for coming on. And the book is Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. You can get it on Amazon, right? Anywhere else they can get that?
Get it on Amazon.com. And of course, if you go into Barnes and Noble, it's usually locally here in Minnesota. It's on the shelves all the time.
Oh, that's cool. Wow, that must be pretty cool. Walking in and seeing that.
It is, even after all these years, it's still on the shelves. I'm guessing mainly because it's a Minnesota published book, because it's published by the Minnesota Historical Society.
Yep.
But you can order it from Barnes and Noble, and or get it on Amazon. And Amazon, if you go to Barnes and Noble, they're going to charge you $29.95 plus sales tax, so it's going to probably be about $32. If you go to Amazon, you can get it for, I think, 21 or something.
Well, there we go.
If you do it on Amazon and you pay 21, the author still gets a little bit. So,
right. All right. Well, there you have it, guys. Hopefully we'll have George on again to talk some more AWA.
I hope so. I love, and we'll talk other territories too.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
love talking wrestling. You do a good job, Ed. Thank you.